Thank you so much, Harmony, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to be here today to talk to you more about the Community Land Act, which is a package of bills that our coalition, the New York City Community Land Initiative, and many other organizations that have signed on as endorsers are pushing to pass this year in the City Council. And we'll talk more about the details of what makes up the Community Land Act. But we're particularly excited to be here because we are first and foremost advocates for communities controlling the development of their neighborhoods, controlling land and community assets. And our interest in talking to all of you in particular is that we know that as the literature on the social determinants of health have grown and become more clear. What our coalition has been saying all along has been, confirmed and reaffirmed over and over again that neighborhoods need to be able to decide for themselves what gets built in their own communities, for who, and determining, access to places like green spaces, affordable housing, health clinics, hospitals. All of those things have such a huge impact on health outcomes. So we're really happy to be making this connection directly between the community land trust movement and all of you who are working on the front lines to promote health and health outcomes in our communities. So for today, we talk a lot about community land trusts and this bill package across the city. But for today, we wanted to kind of start from a slightly different place and start off in Philadelphia for a second. So many of you might have seen headlines over the last several years about the Hammond Hospital in Philadelphia, PA. And for us, this case study is a perfect example of what it is that we're trying to address through the Community Land Act and through the Community Land Trust movement more broadly. So many of you might have seen, national headlines about this hospital that was a safety net hospital serving low-income communities in Philadelphia. And it was targeted by private equity because it was sitting on what promised to be very valuable land in a neighborhood that was rapidly gentrifying, land in a neighborhood where condos and luxury housing was being built left and right on every corner. And private equity firms saw this as an opportunity to speculate on that land, seize it from the community, and build something that would be more profitable. So ultimately, they allowed a hospital that was serving a critical need in the community to fail, to go into bankruptcy, meanwhile protecting the assets, the real estate assets, from bankruptcy, so that they can profit from it later. And during the COVID crisis, we actually saw the city virtually begging the owners of this land to allow the hospital to reopen, which they refused to do without a sizable payment up front for 6 months during the pandemic. So it was a really stark case of how real estate speculation could be damaging to the health of a community. But this is nothing new, right? I think everyone here is probably aware that real estate speculation, housing, access to hospitals, access to green space, all has an impact on community health. And this is just perhaps one of the most egregious examples. And we don't necessarily need to go to Philadelphia to see this. Although this example made national headlines, we saw the same issue right here in New York City. ANHD published a report during COVID that showed that most of the out-of-borough hospitals that closed in the years prior to the pandemic were concentrated in low-income communities of color, many neighborhoods that were also gentrifying and experiencing rapid real estate speculation. And then as a result, when the pandemic happened, it was those exact neighborhoods that needed that hospital space, that needed those hospital beds, but no longer had them, that suffered the worst outcomes during the pandemic. So we've know all too well that this is a problem that's hit New York City, that's hit other cities like New York around the country. And it all comes down to this question of who decides what gets built in our neighborhoods, who decides, who has access to affordable housing, to green space, to health clinics and hospitals, to community centers, to leisure activity, and who gets stuck with power plants, polluting industries, unaffordable housing, who gets stuck with, the problems that many neighborhoods like in Mont Haven, Port Morris, you're going to hear Michael talk about, have experienced for decades. So this is a question that many groups around the city have been thinking about and talking about for a long time, recognizing that when you have land that's being speculated on for profit, it drives a certain kind of development, one that doesn't serve the needs of the community, whether it be housing, whether it be for health access and other needs. So we've been working on an alternative where land is for the people, land is for the community, land is collectively owned, governed, and stewarded by communities for the benefit of those communities. And those neighbors will decide collectively what gets built and for who. And that is the root of the community land trust model that us and our coalition, the New York City Community Land Initiative, has been fighting to promote around the city. And you'll hear more details about the CLT model, as well as examples from Michael about what they're doing in the South Bronx. But the dichotomy between speculation and control of land is what's really been driving our coalition's work to promote equitable development throughout our city. And a key aspect of doing this is the community's participation in deciding what gets built and where and for who. And the tool that we've been using to do this is called a community land trust. So hopefully some of you have heard of community land trusts before, but a CLT is essentially a nonprofit entity, nonprofit organization that seeks to take land off of the speculative market to ensure that it gets developed for housing and other needs in an inclusive and affordable way that benefits the community forever, in perpetuity, to make sure that land can no longer be subject to the speculation that has driven, the development of unaffordable, luxury condos and other speculative development that has pushed out communities, particularly in Black and brown neighborhoods around the city. So a community land trust is the tool that communities are using more and more around the city to accomplish this goal and take land off the speculative market. So our CLT, just to reiterate, it's a nonprofit, and the nonprofit seeks to collectively own and collectively steward that land for the community. The way CLTs do this is through a separation of ownership. So the land that sits underneath the buildings will always and forever be owned by the community land trust. And then the buildings that sit on the land can be leased out for different purposes. So a community land trust can work with, a single family homeowner and lease out the land to that homeowner who will own the improvements or own the house while the community land trust continues to own the land. And it does that through a long-term ground lease. And that ground lease dictates the terms that any resale of that property has to abide by. So if the homeowner decides to move, they can sell the house, but it has to be to another family that meets certain income requirement, has to be used for the purpose that the community decided. And it could be for the purpose of housing, but it could also be for other purposes as well, which we'll explore in a bit, including things like community centers, multifamily buildings, hospitals or community spaces, clinics, and things along those lines. But the CLT regulation is what gives community control over what gets developed. So here's just an example, an illustration of kind of how the CLT works and how the ground lease structure works. So the community owns the land underneath the property in perpetuity. It uses a 99-year ground lease to make sure that whatever gets built on it stays affordable and accessible to the community indefinitely. And the residents or the organization or leases that occupy the building itself will own the improvements and make sure that they're abiding by the rules of the ground lease. So what makes a CLT different than any other organization that might be building housing or building community centers or things like that? There are a few different characteristics that make CLTs unique. One is the democratic governance. So CLTs are run by a board that's representing three key constituencies. So we call it a tripartite board or a three-part board. So one constituency that's represented on the board are the residents. So these could be folks who are living in, let's say a multifamily building that sits on a community land trust land, much like a co-op, right, or something along those lines. Those residents will have representation on the board of the CLT. But in addition to them, we have other members from the surrounding community who also will sit on the board of the community land trust. And this creates, a balance between stakeholders in the community, those that live on the land and those who, benefit from the community staying affordable, from the community offering things like community programming and community centers and health clinics and things like that. And then lastly, we have a third group that's made up of advisors. And these could be folks who have certain special, technical knowledge or expertise, folks who know about development, who know about housing, who know about running community centers or whatever else the community land trust is interested in supporting. And they can offer their technical advice while serving on the board. The second part that makes CLTs unique compared to other organizations is this idea of being for the community through ongoing organizing. So it's absolutely essential that a CLT remains constant in its organizing efforts to continue to bring community members together to make sure that it's supporting the broader vision that the community has for the neighborhood, which may also include expanding, right? Getting more land, taking more land off the speculative market so that they can offer more deeply affordable housing, community services, and things along those lines. And then lastly, the flexibility of the model, which I've already stressed a few times at this point, but it's really important to emphasize that CLTs offer such amazing flexibility in terms of what we can do on the CLT land. So community land trusts around New York City today are working on developing deeply affordable rental housing that sits on community land trust land, deeply affordable co-op and limited equity, shared equity co-ops, single family homes, community centers, green space, commercial space, pretty much anything that you can think of your neighborhood needing, community land trusts can make sure that they're providing that. The more land that they're able to acquire, the more opportunities we're able to create for deeply affordable services, housing, and other community uses. So together, the flexibility, the ongoing organizing, and the democratic governance is what makes community land trusts a really unique model for neighborhood development with community vision. So here's just another kind of example, a visual representation of how community land trusts work. So again, community ownership of the land, the ground lease, and then some kind of housing built on top. And here's a few examples. It can support single family homes, limited equity co-ops, a mutual housing association of renters, and things along those lines. And again, it doesn't just have to be restricted to housing. You can use community land trusts for all kinds of other services and community needs like urban agriculture, small business, access to commercial space, open green space, particularly in neighborhoods that have lacked access to parks and things like that, and community centers and things along those lines, as well as things like health clinics and hospitals and other vital community services. So you might ask, what is the community land trust landscape look like in New York City today? Well, here's a map of CLTs in New York. We've come a long way in the last decade, where just 20 years ago, there was really just like one community land trust operating in New York City, which is the Cooper Square CLT in the Lower East Side, which today has over 300 units of deeply affordable housing, as well as 22 commercial spaces that sit on their community land trust. But other than that, at the time, there wasn't much activity in the CLT space. But luckily, because of a lot of the advocacy we've been doing as a coalition and work we've been doing to educate communities around the city about this model, we now have over 20 community land trusts that are either formed or in formation, 9 of which have acquired land at this point, and have actively taken land off the speculative market and are working to build housing, community space, and meet other community needs in their neighborhoods. So hopefully you see a CLT on the map that might be close to you, where you're doing your work, and we would definitely encourage you to connect with them, and we're happy to make those connections if that's something you would like to do. So all of this is really to preempt our conversation about this legislative package that we're here to talk about, which is the Community Land Act. So one of the things that we noticed about supporting the community land trust movement around New York City is, as you can imagine, acquiring land is very difficult to do, particularly in New York City, where it's a very hot real estate market. So acquiring land on the open market is hard. New York City has a long history of giving public land away to private developers that have built housing that's unaffordable to most communities. So we want to make sure that we're setting community land trusts up for success, that we're creating more pathways to build out the pipeline of property that can go into community ownership, take that land off the speculative market, and make sure there's no more opportunities for private equity firms and investors to come in and speculate on that land in our communities, ultimately displacing our neighbors from the city. So we came up with a package of bills that we call the Community Land Act, which is actually made up of several different pieces of legislation that we're fighting to pass so that we can increase that pipeline and grow the CLT movement further and set it up for success. So we're really going to focus on these first top 2 pieces, the Community Opportunity to Purchase Act and Public Land for Public Good today. But we'd be happy to talk more about the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act and the abolish and replacing the lien sale in New York City if we have more time at another session or a later date, or happy to talk offline if you're interested. So just before jumping into the legislation, wanted to highlight that we've already made tremendous progress in building out support for the Community Land Act. So last year, we had almost 2/3 of the city council supporting COPA and Public Land for Public Good. So we were at that precipice of a veto-proof majority in city council supporting this legislation. We had 2/3 of city council already, supporting the concept of not reauthorizing the lien sale, which again, we can talk about offline. We did end up making a compromise with the city about that, but we had tremendous support around that principle. And we have over 130 community groups who have endorsed the Community Land Act, including community-based organizations and CDCs, tenant associations, and the Health and Housing Consortium as well. So we're really excited to have such a broad umbrella of support around this concept of the Community Land Act. And we're hoping that each of you and your individual organizations could also consider signing on and endorsing the CLA, which we can talk about how to do that in a little bit. And in addition to having all of that institutional support, we know that the Community Land Act is popular among New Yorkers. So we know that 80% of voters have said that they want New York City to prioritize social housing like community land trusts. We know that 72% of voters have said that they support public land for public good, prioritizing nonprofit developers for public land disposition. 60% have said that the city should financially support community land trusts. And 82% of voters said they support the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, one of the components of the Community Land Act. So we know that this is popular when you talk to community members about it. We know it's popular amongst city council members. We know it's popular amongst the community-based organizations that represent communities, particularly communities of color and low-income neighborhoods around the city. So we know that this is popular. We just need more voices to come together to push it over the finish line and get it passed. So now we want to just talk quickly about those two bills that are part of the package that kind of like lead the way in terms of what we're trying to pass this year. The first one is the Community Opportunity to Purchase Act. What this bill would do was it would give qualified community land trusts and other nonprofits the right to make a first offer when a multifamily building is going up for sale by its landlord. So essentially, if a landlord decides they want to sell their property, that's great. Give community land trusts and other nonprofit CDCs, a chance to make the first offer, essentially giving us a foot in the door to purchase that property before another third-party buyer can come in and make an offer and pull it out from underneath us. So essentially what this does is it gives CLTs more of an opportunity to work with tenants in buildings, particularly those that have been long neglected by their landlords. We know that there are tons of slumlords in the city. There are tons of landlords that speculated on rent-stabilized buildings back before 2019 when the rent laws changed, thinking that they can deregulate all those units and make a killing. And then we changed the laws on them, and now all of a sudden they can't make the killing they thought they could. So we want CLTs to be able to come in and make that first offer to acquire those properties, take them off the speculative market, finally give those tenants an opportunity to get the repairs done that have, that the landlords have failed to do, fix all those violations, and make sure that those units stay permanently affordable, and engage those tenants in community ownership and stewardship of that property, which is ultimately our goal, that we want tenants, community members, and advisors to come together to steward this land indefinitely for the benefit of the community. So this would give us an opportunity to do that through the private market. It's a successful idea in other cities, so we modeled it on legislation that's already in practice in places like San Francisco and Washington, D.C., which together have already been able to preserve thousands of affordable housing units through this model, through this type of opportunity to purchase legislation. And ultimately, it engages New York City's robust nonprofit housing sector, CLTs, CDFIs, and other stakeholders to take land off the speculative market. It will grow the capacity of our organizations and our CLTs by giving us more opportunities to acquire land and preserve housing. So we see it as a really important tool that will be able to grow the CLT movement and make sure that we're caring for people throughout the city's, lower income gentrifying neighborhoods, making sure that they're able to stay in place in their communities. We have an example. Some people might say, is this possible? How will it work in New York City? And we have a, proof of concept that's been implemented in East New York in Brooklyn. The East New York Community Land Trust recently acquired a property at 248 Arlington Avenue from a landlord who was exactly that kind of typical landlord that we talked about, someone who bought the building before 2019, thinking they would be able to deregulate a lot of these units and make a killing from raising the rent. And then the rent laws changed, and all of a sudden he couldn't do that. So as a result, repairs in the building started to suffer. The conditions started to go south, and tenants began organizing and eventually connected with the land trust and wanted the land trust to come in and acquire the property. So East New York was able to do that with 100% privately raised money from philanthropy, from CDFIs and other groups. So they took no government money in order to make the acquisition. and they were able to buy that property from the landlord. And that's exactly what we see COPA being able to do, is to convince landlords that the CLT, right, is the organization they should be talking to, because they're the ones that have the right to make a first offer. So it would bring the landlord to the table and give the CLT an opportunity to work out a deal to acquire that property. As a result, the CLT in East New York is working with tenants to convert this building into a co-op. So it'll be a limited equity cooperative that sits on top of the CLT land, meaning that a lot of these tenants will now be, co-op owners collectively. They'll collectively own the building. And the CLT and the tenants are currently working on getting those repairs done, addressing those violations, and doing the things the landlord neglected to do for so long. So we believe that this model is replicable across the city. And if we have COPA in place, we'll be able to scale it much, much faster and get groups around New York City, particularly in these lower income Black and brown neighborhoods, to acquire land and bring it under community control faster. So you might say that sounds great as a acquisition strategy for private property. What about all the public land in New York City? So we've also thought about that, and we want to pass a bill called Public Land for Public Good that would require New York City to prioritize community land trusts and other qualified nonprofits when the city decides to get rid of public land, or to do public land dispositions to third-party entities. So right now, if the city wants to dispose of public land, it opens up an RFP process, and nonprofits and for-profit developers and everyone kind of submits their RFP, and the city has some criteria that they look at to determine who gets the property. But unfortunately, we know that far too often those deals are given to for-profit developers that don't build the kind of affordable housing or kind of community space or commercial space or other uses that our neighborhoods really need. So we want to make sure that if there's a CLT operating in that neighborhood, if there's a nonprofit that does good work that qualifies for the project, that they're given priority, because they're the ones that will be able to build the kind of services, address the community needs and build the housing that our neighbors actually need. So we know that throughout the city's history, most of those dispositions have been awarded to for-profits, and that has exacerbated gentrification and displacement. And we want to make sure that, while we're encouraging the city to prioritize CLTs and nonprofits, we want to be very clear that a lot of those CLTs are operating in collaboration with for-profit developers, MWBEs, and others through joint ventures, right? So it's not cutting these folks out, but it's really putting CLTs in the driver's seat to determine what's going to get built there, who's it going to be for, and how affordable is it going to be. And why is this important? Well, we know that the majority of public land dispositions have been concentrated in low-income Black and brown neighborhoods around the city. And we know that the units that are built on public land, for the most part, have not been affordable to the people in those neighborhoods. So we know that, for instance, only half of the units essentially built in East New York in Brooklyn have been affordable to the median income family in that neighborhood, right? Which is not good enough. So we want to make sure that the affordable housing that's being built in those neighborhoods is truly affordable, and nonprofits have a better track record of building deeper affordability. We've done the research, we have the records, and we think that they're the ones that should be in the driver's seat. And we have a great example of why that would be important for community health and community access to community centers right here with us with Mont Haven Port Morris Community Land Stewards. So I'll pass it over to Michael to talk a little bit about the work that they're doing in the South Bronx.
Thanks, Will, and thanks for that deep background on how we've gotten here and what we're working on as a coalition. In the South Bronx, we as a resident, as a father raising a family, and like many others who are doing the same, we came together more than a decade ago, fighting for environmental justice because of the health disparities. Our community was the health situation that was imposed on our community because of top-down decisions, leading with high rates of asthma, obesity, diabetes, um, cardiovascular disease, a community that suffers and carries and shoulders a burden for a lot of environmental harm. And the decisions that created the environmental harm never really incorporated what communities actually needed or really wanted to see in terms of development, especially on public land. As Will mentioned, we saw a lot of types of development take place in the South Bronx, where it was either a highway being built, a prison being built, fossil power plants, waste transfer stations, heavy diesel truck intensive businesses, all with the understanding it would create or idea that it would create jobs and economic development, but never did it prepare us or create any kind of healthier outcomes. So a community that was fighting for the right to breathe, we came together looking at asset mapping, like you see in this image here, of our current public assets and what we could do in terms of creating healthier outcomes ourselves from the ground up, because the top down wasn't working for us. So in our envisioning and asset mapping, we uncovered a couple different assets that had been providing public benefit and some that never did. One of which was a center operated by Health and Hospitals, where it was a recovery center for opioid and heroin addiction, where they did acupuncture and Reiki instead of methadone for recovery, and it worked. But in 2011, they vacated this building, moving a program that was inside of this structure for more than 3 decades to another facility, leaving this property vacant. We came together as a community and said, well, this is something that we see as a possibility, as an opportunity for us to create a community-driven development project that will create this dynamic of providing what we feel is necessary. And what does that look like? And how do we determine what that really is? So we came together, like you see in this imagery here, and other opportunities in public spaces like community gardens, even out in parks where we came together and determined what was the best use for this 22,000 or about 23,000 square foot facility that was now vacant. And through our envisioning and through our engagement, we determined that the three pillars should be health, education, and the arts. We call it the Heart Center, and that's what you see behind me in my screen. It's a project we thought that was important to focus on these three pillars because we know housing is always on the top five of the list, right? Of having deeply affordable housing, because what we've seen in our community, of course, like Will had mentioned in his presentation, that a lot of the public housing or housing that was being produced was market rate or not really affordable for the people who lived in our community. But what we saw was the real true need for there to be a focus on health because of the health disparities, because of what we were facing. 1 in 5 of our children have an asthma. Asthma hospitalization rates 8 times the national average and 21 times greater than any other New York City community. So our community designated as Asthma Alley, we knew we had to do something first for health. And we had to kind of look at what had happened in the past, how the Young Lords and the Black Panthers who created this acupuncture clinic for recovery of opioid addiction that our community was facing in the 70s, they created a holistic approach to recovery. Well, how can we create a holistic approach to community health? And we brought in these three pillars looking to do that. So as we knew health was super important, our community also knew education was pinnacle. That it was extremely important to have a true sense of health would have to be come from education as well, incorporating that. Because our children had some of the, were subject to the poorest performing school district in New York City, District 7 in my neighborhood. But we know it was pretty much fueled by their cognitive development was directly linked to the air quality they were breathing. So it was environmental. So having healthier outcomes, meaning having better educational outcomes, for having, opportunity to thrive. And but our community is also connected by its arts and culture. So that was extremely important that we connect arts. The way we bring our community together, the multicultural community we have was linking that. But we knew this public building that was, if not for a plan that we create, would be another one of the same, where some non deeply affordable housing would be created. It would tear down this really historical property that gave our community so much hope for decades to bring forth something that we didn't want. And we knew we had to create what we desired. And so this was one of the projects, the South Bronx Unite, the organization I helped to co-found in 2012, helped the community to formulate, and then we created the Commodity Haven Port Morris Community Land Stewards to be the vehicle, the tool in which the community would own and in perpetuity steward this space, this building and this programming within it to ensure healthier outcomes for our community and for our children. But this is one project we worked on for more than a decade. The other was a waterfront plan, which we actually got prioritized by the state of New York to actually give access to our 60,000 people in our community who only have one public park for all 60,000 people, giving our ability to get out to the water's edge, protect ourselves from sea level rise and climate change, to create healthier outcomes and quality, increase quality of life for residents who have been left behind for decades, only to have highways encircle our community, three of which, five bridges that intersect with us, and a feeding of a school to prison pipeline that was only not creating the kind of outcomes we needed as family, as community. But bringing it all of these elements together with an envisioning of community developed ideas, the community coming together to develop their own initiatives and their own plans and own projects. And both of these projects are all public facing, publicly owned, and we knew that we had to have a plan for ourselves. And so these two projects, a health center, our health education and the art center, we called Hearts, and the Mighty Haven Port Morris waterfront plant, all public land, are now geared towards completion or moving towards the actual vision being manifested. The Heart Center, we pushed the city to release an RFP that, again, like Will had mentioned, would not have been afforded to community members or community development projects. We wouldn't have gotten the same kind of weight. But because of our advocacy for decades, we pushed the city to release an RFP that really reflected the community's needs, and having those three pillars being really accented in the actual RFP was really helpful. With a bill like the Public Land for Public Good, it would incentivize these types of developments rather than having to have so much push from local advocacy to make sure it's ensured. The same way with the waterfront plan, pushing our elected officials to make sure they support this plan, support the need for community to get out to a peninsula in which encircles our neighborhood, but our children don't even know exists, to a natural resource to create nature-based solutions, because how important that would to offset the health disparities. So speaking to you all around health and housing is super important on a number of levels, but when it's really important in terms of health and how we even looked at this property, this building, and how we separate these three pillars, and how green, is for health. The blue is education, as you see a section cut of this building, and the lighter pink or orange tone, I'm kind of colorblind, uh, is more of the arts, right? And how we create a real place for our community to have this center that's tying, connecting these three tissues, these three pillars, to create this healthier outcome, this holistic approach to community health that also accentuates the waterfront plan that we're creating as well, all of which will be stewarded by the Mount Haven Port Morris Community Land Stewards, with residents, community members, and professionals who understand the mission, um, and the need for this to happen in perpetuity. And then there'll be other projects we'll work on in phase two or phase three, where we may create a shared housing platform, of where we create another opportunity for there to be deeply affordable shared housing, deep affordable housing for that's missing some of the elements that we don't see happening in our community. I know we have probably the second highest density of public housing in our community in the city, five niche developments, but it's still not meeting some need that's there. And it's really important that as community members, we create that drive for what's needed in our catchment area, which is totally unique to our area, our community needs, that it should be what we need individually, or more hyper-focused need, and we guide and gear our response to that by what our community feels important. Back to Will.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate that. So hopefully everyone got a little bit of an idea of kind of some of the community fights that have been going on for decades and the progress we've made as a movement, but also recognize why we need this legislative package to pass, right? We are fortunate to have folks like Michael and other leaders in the South Bronx fighting for that vision of the Heart Center. But how many public land opportunities have slipped through our fingers in the past, and how many are still yet to be determined, that could benefit if we had public land for public good passed that would prioritize groups like the Mont Haven Port Morris Community Land Stewards in public land disposition, like the one that they're working on. How many of you in your neighborhoods know of public land or see vacant lots that could potentially be publicly owned, that could be converted into community centers, health clinics, or other needs that just aren't being done right now because that's not what the city prioritizes? And likewise, how many rent stabilized apartments, truly affordable housing continues to get sold and flipped and speculated on by real estate investors that are that's being lost to the market year after year. So we're hoping that through passage of this package and through this legislation, we'll be able to meet those needs head on, empower community land trusts to take land back into community ownership, and build the housing, community space, commercial space, and green space that our neighborhoods need. So we can pause here, open it up for questions. Love to hear if folks have ideas or thoughts, or know of projects in your neighborhood that could be supported by community land trusts. But yeah, happy to talk about it all with you. And just in case there are questions after this, feel free to reach out to me. I can also connect you to Michael if you want to throw your contact in the chat as well. I'm happy to talk more. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Will and Michael. I put in the chat box a link to the one-pager that the group has shared with people who may want to learn more about the Community Land Act. So if you would like to share that around with folks within your and within your communities, that would be great. As we wait for people to ask questions, I'm wondering quickly if you could actually speak about the two other components of the CLA package, just very quickly.
Sure, yeah. So similar to what we had talked about with the Community Opportunity of Purchase Act, or COPA, we're also fighting for another bill at the state level called the Tenant Opportunity of Purchase Act. And that bill would essentially do something very similar to COPA, but it directly gives tenants the opportunity to make a first offer when their building goes up for sale, rather than having to work directly through an intermediary. So ultimately, a lot of tenants would end up probably partnering with community land trusts or partnering with other nonprofit housing providers, but it expands the right of tenants to make a first offer. Unfortunately, we can't do that through city legislation for legal purposes, but we believe that passing a state law would be a vehicle to do that. So ultimately, passing COPA or TOPA, mix them up all the time, would be a beneficial tool. Both would be beneficial tools for us to be able to take more land off of the speculative market and preserve deeply affordable housing, but they do it through two different kind of mechanisms or tools. So happy to talk more in detail about how the two of them work and how they could work together and how they would work separately. And then the last piece is around the lien sale. So this is don't want to go too much into the weeds, but many of you might know that unpaid taxes on properties often get packaged and sold to an investor-backed trust, which is a third party that does business with the city. So your unpaid taxes could be, if you have a lien on your property, could be sold to this investor trust, which then goes about trying to collect on your debt, similar to like medical debt collection. And unfortunately, they tack on all of these fees and penalties, essentially putting homeowners, property owners deeper into debt. And unfortunately, a lot of multifamily, buildings, a lot of slumlords end up not paying their taxes, and these properties end up in limbo, with the debt being owned by a debt collector and the landlord not doing their part, and the city essentially not being able to do anything about it. So we have proposed changes to the way the city does its tax collection that would, allow people to stay in their homes, rather than selling their debt to private debt collectors that try and foreclose on them. That would essentially retain the city's leverage over multifamily buildings rather than selling that leverage off to private debt collectors, and essentially create more pathways for these properties to come onto community land trusts or into community ownership, so that we can preserve deeply affordable housing, including deeply affordable home ownership opportunities that many seniors, particularly in Black and brown neighborhoods, lower density neighborhoods around the city, many of them bought their homes a long time ago, are now on fixed incomes and struggle to pay their taxes. So we want to make sure that folks like that don't get displaced. So we have a whole replacement system that we can share with you to learn more about. But we're continuing to fight to make sure that our lien sale system is reformed to the point where, one, we don't sell liens at all, and two, we create more and more pathways for people to be able to stay in their homes.
Thank you. So my next question is, I appreciate Bonnie and Elise for asking questions in the chat box on how can we identify CLTs in our area and how to get involved. Elise shared a map of CLTs in development, and thank you for sharing emails too, in case folks want to learn more with you. But I guess we have a mix of, we have a lot of organizations here who provide direct social services or health services. What are ways that these sorts of organizations can get involved given their scope of work, their expertise, and what have you seen partnerships with direct service organizations look like?
Yeah, definitely. Well, first and foremost, we see, community organizing as a long-term strategy to addressing a lot of the challenges that direct service providers are, dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So, if you're working with communities that are struggling to access deeply affordable housing, struggling to access, community services, we want to work collaboratively to uplift those stories, to connect people to the organizing that's going on in their neighborhoods. And we see community land trusts around the city having really strong partnerships with community-based organizations, some of which are kind of incubated by some of those community-based organizations. So many of you might be familiar with the Cypress Hills Local Development Corporation in East New York. They've actually been the partner, the kind of incubating partner to the East New York Community Land Trust. So those two have worked really closely together to not only do the real estate project that we talked about at Arlington Avenue, but also just to do community organizing and establish, the links between the challenges people are facing in the community and this big long-term solution that we see through community ownership. And another thing I'll mention is that community groups often have a stake in community land trusts, right? So many of us are commercial renters, right? If you're a nonprofit and you're operating in a neighborhood, you probably have to rent an office space or rent community space. And if you're anything like New Economy Project or other organizations, that could be a big chunk of your budget. So we know that permanently affordable community space is just as important as permanently affordable housing and access to green space and things like that. So we want to see more CLTs linking up with nonprofits in their neighborhoods that are doing direct service, because we envision that a lot of CLTs want to have those organizations as as residents, as tenants on the property. And Western Queens Community Land Trust comes to mind as a group that's working with a lot of nonprofits in the area. And they're working on a project in Long Island City that will hopefully end up producing a lot of space that local organizations can be based out of. So yeah, we see a lot of opportunities for those connections, and think that that's the kind of work we want to see at the neighborhood level. I don't know, Michael, if you have any.
I do. Yeah, I do.
Yeah, there you go.
Before we sign off, I just want to say that, because we're really focused on a serious health pillar and health centered approach to a holistic approach to wellness and healing in the South Bronx. Any folks who have any ideas or can have a conversation with us about how best to achieve that, we're really looking for participation in that pillar around health and wellness and healing for our community. The traditional sense of medicine has not really helped us. It's probably one of the largest employers in the Bronx. Not that it's not helpful, but we're looking to heal our community, and we need to think outside the box, look at more ways to do that with screenings and a holistic approach to that healing and wellness. So that we're putting a call out to folks who are have any ideas or interest in that, of lending their ear or their voice to helping us achieve that goal, that to reach the measure of a healthier outcomes for our community members is super important for us.
I'm so glad you posed that question, and I think this is a great way to close. The Health and Housing Consortium is more than happy and is eager to facilitate connections, whether it be if you're an attendee from an organization who wants to learn more about the Community Land Act, we could connect you to Will and Michael. And if Michael, you or if anyone has ideas to contribute to or the development of the wellness and healing pillar of the Heart's work, we could facilitate those connections with you too. But we are at the hour. I think this is a good place to close. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. We will be sending, or we have some resources in the chat box. We'll also be sharing the slides and the recording. If you would like to learn more about the Community Land Act, feel free to email me, and I'll connect you with Will and Michael and Elise. And be on the lookout for future advocacy spotlight series highlights. Hopefully we'll have more in the summer. And I will quickly add some more trainings that we have in our calendar for the rest of the month. We have a training on city FEPs. For those who are members with the Health and Housing Consortium, we have a training on problem gambling. And then at the end of the month, we have a networking happy hour fundraiser. Again, thank you, Will, Michael, and everyone for joining. And thank you so much for sharing more and giving us a thorough overview of the Community Land Act.
Thank you for having us. Yeah.
Yes. All right.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.